The Middle Ages, a time of knights, castles, kings, churches, diseases, and sick torture methods. At least, those are the stereotypical ideas most people have of the Middle Ages in the Western world. And because most people's ideas about the Middle Ages are mostly based on what some parts of Western Europe were roughly like during this 1,000-year period, you may not realize how much more the Middle Ages were than just knights, castles, and kings. We as a post-medieval society have mostly collectively decided the Middle Ages started around the fall of the Roman Empire in 476 AD, or at least the western part of it. The eastern half was there to stick around for much longer, more specifically until 1453, when the Ottomans finally decided they'd had enough.
Woo! To the good onion. Good onion is a heavy onion.
Many people consider the end of the Eastern Roman Empire to also be the end of the Middle Ages, although this is debated, since the Middle Ages is simply a 1,000-year period with a number of connecting threads that we decided to give a name. And this millennium can further be divided into 3 different periods: the early, high, and late Middle Ages. I guess they had to name the middle period of the Middle Ages the High Middle Ages, so they didn't have to refer to it as the Middle Ages. The Roman Empire had already been struggling since the 3rd century, but after the fall of the western half, it wouldn't be inaccurate to claim that Western Europe was set back several hundred years. This period is often called the Dark Ages, as it was first described by a snobby Italian scholar from the 14th century who couldn't find enough good books from this time for his reading list. The term Dark Ages can at best only be applied to Western Europe, since many other parts of human civilization during the Dark Ages were in fact thriving. Constantinople took over Rome's position as the dominant trading center of Europe and remained one of the largest and most advanced cities in Europe for centuries. China was split into a cultural and political north and south between 386 and 581 AD, but the two halves traded with each other, and the fact that China had a much more centralized government than Europe greatly helped China to reach its cultural golden age during the Tang dynasty, between the 7th and 10th centuries. Just to name some examples, China used an ancient variant of the book press roughly 800 years before the Europeans did, allowing a much wider range of people access to literature. Its capital, Chang'an, was likely the most populous city in the world at the time with over 1 million inhabitants. In the Middle East, where Islam was still a relatively new religion, the rulers of the Abbasid Caliphate actively encouraged education for its citizens much more than many other regions during this time. Knowledge! Although even here, the academic world was dominated by men and the elite, which was usually the case for most societies until recently. Many inventions and scientific discoveries were born during this cultural golden age, such as using a toothbrush instead of your neighbor's urine, hard soap, decent hospitals, and algebra.
I really should have just stayed in the water.
Yeah, I agree. The oldest university still in use is a mosque in Morocco, a place where worship and teaching happened in tandem. It was founded between 857 and 859 by a woman who was first mentioned by an Islamic scholar who lived hundreds of years later, and said woman may or may not actually have existed, but maybe she did, who knows? Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, was very likely the largest city on earth alongside Chang'an, but we don't know for sure when which city was more populous. So really the quote-unquote Dark Ages were really not that dark and gloomy at all if you look at it from a global perspective. But to understand why we make such a clear distinction between antiquity and the Middle Ages, we need to look back at the end of the Western Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, despite its immense success, had never been a perfect system, far from it, and foreign developments became a far bigger problem than they had during the Pax Romana, the time when the Roman Empire wasn't on fire 24/7, metaphorically speaking. Their neighbors, the Persians, who underwent political reforms in the early 3rd century, which made them much more capable and keen on coming to clashes with the Romans, forced the Romans to focus their military operations in the far east of the empire. The Persians, who were then called the Sasanian Empire, even captured the Roman Emperor Valerian in 260 AD, and although a certain Christian Roman author claimed that the emperor was brutally skinned alive or forced to swallow molten gold, or both, other sources say he just died as a slave, which is probably what actually happened. In the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was slowly turning into a hot mess when Roman armies played the biggest role in who was emperor ever since the 3rd century. With that power, they could relatively easily dispose of emperors who didn't pay them enough, and dispose they did, thus resulting in 26 emperors in just 50 years. Mass immigration, existential threats from capable rivals, along with hyperinflation and a massive plague did not help matters. Emperor Diocletian, or as I like to call him, Cabbage Man, brought the empire much relief by officially splitting it into an eastern and a western part. Instead of just one emperor, the Roman Empire now had an emperor to rule the west and one to rule the east, both of whom had another junior emperor, so no one ever had too much to deal with. This new form of administration, known as the Tetrarchy, ended the crisis of the 3rd century. Diocletian ruled the entire empire for 2 years and later just the eastern part for 18 years, while the very beardy Maximian ruled most of the west. Gaul and Britain and the Balkans were ruled by their junior emperors. Diocletian later retired, claiming the state of his cabbages as an important reason. What may surprise you is that the period between 300 and 375 was surprisingly prosperous. Can't say the same for now. By analyzing the density of pottery fragments among other things, archaeologists and researchers have been able to deduce that this 75-year period experienced more agricultural output than ever before. So it's clear the crisis of the 3rd century was not directly related to the ultimate fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476. Between 376 and 380, massive groups of a certain people named the Huns attacked the Goths, who were one of the Roman Empire's neighbors and had economic ties and occasionally military ties with them. The arrival of the Huns forced the Goths to flee to the south, into the Roman Empire. Unfortunately, the Empire was busy with, well, everything, and they couldn't handle this surprise Goth diaspora. Therefore, a couple decades later, in the beginning of the 5th century, the Visigoths, led by this dude named Alaric I, was tired of the Romans failing to subsidize his army, and he sacked Rome in 410 to show everyone just how upset he was. One of Rome's biggest problems was its shortage of Romans truly loyal to the emperor due to the combination of fighting foreign invaders and civil wars. The economy mostly revolved around agriculture, and farmers had to pay taxes, which the Romans used to pay their armies. It was written in law that the position of farmer was hereditary. Naturally, Rome didn't have any Roman soldiers left, so they instead moved to the Germanic peoples, who were usually much more loyal to their own commanders as opposed to the Romans. This meant that at the end of the western half's life, the Romans didn't actually control their own half of the empire. Instead, the blueprint for the political division of the early Middle Ages had already been established. Eventually, the Romans couldn't afford to pay most of these foreign peoples who had agreed to fight for Rome. In 476, a Germanic general, whose name I really don't know how to pronounce, led a revolt against the emperor, who was actually a child and probably explicitly selected to be controllable, and disposed him. This was the true fall of the Western Roman Empire, even though it hadn't been fully Roman in a long time. There are many reasons the Eastern Roman Empire survived until the late Middle Ages in 1453. Here are some of them. The Bosporus Strait made it difficult for Asian invaders to go through Europe, since the Roman navy was always present. Its capital, Constantinople, was strategically placed here on a rocky peninsula, and the Theodosian walls which enclosed the city made invading the city exceedingly difficult. Another reason is that the East managed to deal with the existential threat of the Sassanid Empire. One reason why is because the Persians, who were more similar to the Romans because of their centralized government, were relatively easier to predict and negotiate with than the many Germanic tribes the West had to deal with. The Roman Empire was split into two in 395. However, they were still expected to help each other out in times of crisis. In 468, the East helped with a large military operation to try and win back northern Africa, but that failed catastrophically, and so the East decided that helping out the western part really wasn't in their best interest. In fact, the East's wealth helped them to bribe their enemies, such as Attila the Hun and the Germanic peoples, to prevent them from attacking them, a luxury which the West didn't have. As a result of the Gothic Wars, the flow of money into Rome in the form of taxes and agricultural goods dropped dramatically, and Rome's wealthiest citizens either died out and left their wealth to the Christian Church or moved to Constantinople. Although Rome and large parts of Italy were now under the rule of what the Romans would call barbarians, the administration that succeeded the Romans didn't drastically change many of the Roman ways of life and governance. After a series of circumstances in the year 537 that will take far too long to dive into, the Eastern Roman Empire attempted to reconquer Rome. After decades of fighting, which ruined both sides, Rome was once again in the hands of the Eastern Roman Empire, and it reached its territorial peak around 555 AD. Tragically, they would lose much of the territory they had won not soon afterwards. Rome would stay under their control for about 2 centuries, although the regional political influence slowly shifted more towards the favor of the Pope and the Church. The early Middle Ages saw fewer large nation-states compared to the late classical antiquity, at least in Western Europe. Specifically in Rome, 11 of the 13 major aqueducts that provided water to the city were sealed off or destroyed, exacerbating Rome's population collapse. Between the 2nd and 6th centuries, Rome's population plummeted from 1 million to around 30,000. The map turned into a complete mess of countless different duchies and kingdoms as opposed to the centralized Roman government of the 1st and 2nd centuries. One of the most important things that glued this enormous political mess together was faith. Christianity originated in the Roman Empire in Judea, in what is now the two very friendly countries of Israel and Palestine. Throughout the Middle Ages, the spread of Christianity would be essential in understanding how people lived their lives and how Western Europe was structured. If you've been taught history in high school, you should have learned a little about the Crusades. Broadly speaking, the Crusades were a collection of religious wars that categorized the High and Late Middle Ages. The standard, oversimplified perception of the Crusades is that the Pope, with his political power, ordered a series of operations to convert the Muslims from the East to Christianity. However, that's only the tip of the iceberg. Besides the expedition to the Holy Land, there are also Crusades in Eastern Europe, mostly in the Baltics and in Prussia. Although these wars were approved by the Church, they were run by local monarchs and knights. Crusades even happened not far from where they were ordered. You may remember Martin Luther and the beginning of Protestantism as an important turning point in the political power of the Church. But the Catholic Church was already facing its fair share of internal threats centuries before then. The Pope and the Catholic Church enacted crusades against other Christian groups whose beliefs didn't quite exactly match those of Catholicism. These religious movements were seen as threatening to Catholicism's grip on both the spiritual and the political world, and some argued that they were even more dangerous than the spread of Islam. Miraculously, crusades were also organized against individual people. In 1199, Pope Innocent III, whose name and face were an important reason for being included in this video, ordered a crusade against Mark von Anweiler.
Hello, everybody.
Mark was a knight who was loyal to the Holy Roman Emperor, who rose through the ranks and ultimately ruled several Italian territories. When the Holy Roman Emperor and previous King of Sicily, Henry VI, died of malaria, Mark attempted to become regent of Sicily, which really just meant being the puppet master of the toddler King Frederick II, second name Electric Boogaloo. By becoming regent of Sicily, he and his German allies would control vast wealth and they'd be able to exert greater control over the Pope. He argued he should get the role because he already ruled highly strategic territories and was reportedly good chums with the previous king, Henry VI. Both Pope Innocent III and Henry's widow, Constance, didn't like that idea, mostly because they didn't want Sicily to fall into German hands. So when Constance died, Innocent III innocently stepped in as the boy's caretaker. But Markward was feeling power-hungry and declared himself the rightful regent anyway, based on Henry VI's will, which Mark may or may not have just entirely made up.
We made this one up. It's a made-up tale. It's a total fabrication.
Blasphemously, he allied himself with Sicily's Muslim population, which made the Pope very upset. This is also what prompted him to send a very foreboding letter to the people of Sicily, comparing Markward to the likes of Saladin, who captured Jerusalem a number of decades prior. Innocent III prioritized Sicily because it would have been quite embarrassing to try and reconquer the Holy Land, but he couldn't even govern parts of Italy. He offered anyone willing to fight Markward spiritual privileges such as the cleansing of previous sins. This was a great deal, since local Italians didn't need to travel all the way to the Holy Land in order to gain the same spiritual prestige. The Pope also reluctantly hired a French nobleman named Walter III of Brienne to command the armies against Mark. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, the actual details of the crusade itself are pretty vague, and historians argue the crusade didn't really get anywhere. The crusade ended pretty quickly in 1202 when Markwart von Anweiler died from a surgery trying to remove kidney stones in a town called Patti. That is, in fact, the origin of St. Patty's Day. The people in Rome were pretty happy with his death, but the problem of German influence in Italy would linger for a long time. If you were a normal medieval peasant and you didn't have the skills to go on a crusade to cleanse your own sins, there were other ways to cleanse yourself. Contrary to popular belief, medieval people, including peasants, quite enjoyed bathing and were not as gross as they are often portrayed in modern media. They enjoyed bathing so much that they wrote a rather long poem about the process sometime in the 11th century. This included excellent advice about how you should wash your hands and face in the morning, and an illustration of a queen having a bath, so it was never too boring for the normal person. So at least they possess some of the most basic of hygienic rules. Despite that wonderful book, the idea of the four humors, which was used by the ancient Greeks and Romans, was at the height of its popularity during most of the European Middle Ages. Based on this medical belief, baths were often recommended to keep the four humors of the body in balance. Some medieval texts claimed excessively long baths could lead to fatness and feebleness. Technically, those two traits were often seen as a sign of royalty, so maybe monarchs enjoyed taking baths to feel properly regal. Since antiquity, many people have had a kind of fascination with water. Every life form we know about needs water to survive, and naturally some superstition arose about certain water sources containing magical rejuvenation powers. Random objects made for the elite sometimes included illustrations or carvings of these mythical fountains of youth. As a side effect of rejuvenation, the return of the libido was a core element in this process, which is evident in the many wall paintings of people having a swell time. Towns explicitly had different rules for their bathhouses. The Italian town of Burmi explicitly stated that in order to reap the health benefits of bathing, people should not have too much sex before using the local bath site, nor should they have too little of it. You also needed to have an empty stomach, and if you had a beard, the hairs on your face would have impeded the water's natural healing effects. It was recommended people use the baths an hour a day for 15 days, and if everything went according to plan, you would have benefited from improved health for up to 6 months. Their source?
My source is that I made it the fuck up.
A certain legend
Is it the Legend 27?
/ novel from the 12th century hints at the importance of bathing for noble women. In this book, a woman named Melusine is cursed by her mother for her legs to turn into the tail of a snake every Saturday. She marries a man named Raymondin on the condition that he never looks at her on Saturdays. It takes about 10 years before Raymondin's family starts questioning why Limousine won't attend mass with them on Saturdays, and he soon finds out her secret. If this illustration is to be trusted, Raymondine was so shocked to see her wife with a reptilian tail, wings, and an apparent lack of bosom, a jet of water spontaneously erupted from his hat.
I think that's just his feather.
I think I prefer my interpretation. Raymondin is understandably upset and tells the whole town his wife is a scaly. She does the only logical thing to do, which is to turn into a dragon and fly out the window. Bathhouses were quite popular among the normal citizens. The church, however, did not always approve of this. Here's a quote by a 13th century church writer I think summarizes what the church thought of this matter. Hast thou washed thyself in the bath with thy wife and other women and seen them nude, and they thee? If thou hast, thou shouldst fast for 3 days on bread and water. They truly were the fun police. When the Middle Ages ended, the popularity of communal bathing plummeted. Likely one of the reasons was the rapid spread of the bubonic plague in the 14th century, aka the Black Death, which wiped out 1/3 of Europe's population. Quality of life for the average peasant actually increased significantly in the aftermath of the plague, since land became much cheaper and high-quality food became more readily available. At the end of the 15th century, the spread of syphilis put the final nail in the coffin, or bathtub, I guess. Instead of killing most people within a few days, syphilis tormented the infected host for decades before they finally died. More importantly, syphilis was an STD, and because many bathhouses were just brothels with extra steps, the idea of visiting a bathhouse just didn't seem that exciting anymore. One thing we take for granted in the modern age is how the vast majority of human knowledge is always just a few swipes away. This was not the case 1,000 or so years ago, and it is only natural to assume that there were plenty of things the average person believed that now seem unintentionally hilarious. You probably know what most animals look like. Imagine a pelican, for example. Besides being naturally goofy looking, pelicans are not known to engage in infantile necromancy. An unknown Christian author from Alexandria begged to differ. The Physiologus is a collection of moralized beast tales written somewhere between the 4th and 6th centuries. It was sort of similar to an ancient collection of fables, but more directly and obviously grounded in Christian morals. The pelican in the Physiologus was described to be such a good parent that it would tear open its chest to revive its dead hatchlings. Every story in the Physiologus was not so much a scientific description of various animals as it was a collection of stories that tried to explain how religion was present in daily life everywhere.
Oh my god, bro. Oh, hell no, man. What the fuck, man?
The mother pelican ripping open its chest to revive its young is a reference to how Jesus died on the cross for the sins of the people. The tale about the pelican also mentioned that the chicks died because they kept striking mother pelican in the face, and as any good mother would, mother pelican then struck them back and killed them. But then after 3 days she felt really guilty and decided to sacrifice herself in order to revive her young. A certain Christian scholar named Augustine of Hippo, who probably inspired Sinterklaas, explained that the mother killing her young symbolized God killing the old sinful ways of humanity in order to start anew in the trust in Jesus Christ. So to all the mothers watching this, next time you see your offspring in a dire situation, be sure to rip open your chest and spill your blood all over them. They may be confused at first, but they'll understand later when they're older. Other iterations of this story that made it into bestiaries from the later Middle Ages omitted the killing of the chicks and focused solely on the reviving part. And because Christianity was so important in medieval Europe, people often believed them because it was proof of how God was everywhere. In fact, they also used to think that every animal on Earth was created by God in order to teach humanity a moral lesson. Due to the lack of scientific books about zoology and the dependence on religious texts and stories from people who may or may not have existed, the scientific truth of how many animals reproduced was not known to the common folk. You see, it was a common belief in medieval Europe that the barnacle goose and the brant goose did not lay eggs, but were instead created by the Almighty God to begin their life hanging from a branch or being trapped in a piece of rotting driftwood. Yes, they thought geese grew on trees. There were a few reasons as to why they believed this. Although the goose tree myth may have been older, the first clear story that propagated this belief was from a book published roughly in 1187 about the findings of an expedition written by a royal clerk who worked for King Henry II of England, not long after the British conquered large parts of Ireland. This clerk, who had been known as Gerald of Wales, wrote about what he observed about barnacle geese and proceeded to make several massive assumptions about them. He wrote about how he saw a piece of driftwood floating on the water. On it, he thought he witnessed barnacle geese being birthed from the shells of shellfish attached to the wood. The much more likely truth is that he simply saw a cluster of goose barnacles, which refers to a species of barnacle attached to the wood. He mentions how the supposed barnacle geese cling by their beaks like seawood, sticking to wood enclosed in shellfish shells for freer development. What he thought were the distinctive black necks of the barnacle goose were most likely just the peduncle of a goose barnacle. This ugly thing. He also mistakes the calcium carbonate plating of a goose barnacle for a sort of egg for the bird. Coincidentally, the barnacle's feeding appendages could have passed as the feathers of a bird for a hyper-Christian scholar who observed the spectacle from probably quite a distance away. He also wrote that these birds came into existence through a gum-like form and fed off watery and woody juice. It was a common Christian belief in the Middle Ages that many animals didn't need parents, but could instead spontaneously pop into existence in the presence of some sort of biological fuel, such as a dead carcass, or in this case, a rotting piece of floating driftwood. Furthermore, he says he saw these barnacle-birthed barnacle geese fly off. In reality, he likely just thought they did because actual geese were also on the piece of driftwood or flying around it. Gerald's description of the barnacle goose also caused a funny loophole where monks convinced themselves they were allowed to eat the meat of barnacle geese on fasting days because they weren't seen as birds who were born from other birds, but more so as fish, which they were allowed to eat. The practice of eating barnacle geese during fasting days was banned by no other than Pope Innocent III in 1213. It was typical for the Middle Ages for people to treat animals like they were humans, not because they believed animals possessed the same moral awareness as humans, but because they wanted to emphasize the role of moral purity in everyday life, and animals happened to sometimes get caught up in that. Every animal's normal instinctive behavior was characterized as directly related to the Word of God. Animal characters in popular bestiaries and especially fables were often portrayed in a very human-like way, which may have been a reason why many people didn't find the premise of putting an animal on trial completely bizarre. No thanks to this bitch.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
Despite the fact that people didn't recognize animals as having the same moral agency as humans, that didn't mean that they were immune to the legal consequences of committing serious crimes. In theory, if you were a dog that barked too much, the church could say that you're a spawn of Satan and you would still have to stand trial. So don't bark too much. In 1478, the Swiss city of Bern was having a bit of a problem with a grub infestation. Despite the church strongly requesting the grubs to leave, the grubs continued munching on their crops and the surrounding vegetation. The grubs were accused of felonies such as trespassing and destroying crops, and the priest issued a legal summons ordering them to appear before court after 6 days. The priests argued that they were imperfect creatures, for they did not appear in Noah's Ark. Some animals were believed to arise spontaneously from decaying debris like the barnacle goose, and the priests believed that the grubs were in that category, and thus an example of living corruption created by the devil.
Objection! Nuh-uh. Fuck you mean, nuh-uh?
This argument stripped the grubs of their divine protection, and it would only be fair for the grubs to have their own legal representative if they were to be treated as equals, and so they did indeed have their own lawyer, although sadly he was described to be a, quote, very inefficient advocate. One of the arguments in favor of the grubs was that the accused were just doing what they were supposed to be doing, eating. The actual outcome of the trial seems to be lost to history, but considering the grubs were ruled to be creations of the devil, it's unlikely the grubs won this case. One of the more well-known cases of an animal being put to trial was that of a pig. In 1386, in the French town of Falaise, a pig supposedly attacked and ate the face of a 3-month-old baby named Genet le Macon, ultimately resulting in his death. The pig was quickly arrested for murder and taken to prison. To avenge the baby's death, the pig's face was first lacerated and maimed in the forelegs before she was hanged. Some versions of the story mention that the pig was dressed in human clothes to emphasize its moral wrongdoings. There are 2 pieces of evidence on which this entire event is based. A receipt in which the local executioner accepts payment for the killing of a pig, and a fresco that was commissioned after the event. The receipt doesn't mention anything about the pig having worn clothes, but the fresco does. There's a slight problem though. It was destroyed when the church in Falaise was being renovated. The image you're seeing right now is a 19th century reconstruction based on descriptions of the original fresco. It's a little unclear when this fresco was commissioned, and the idea that the pig was dressed in human clothes may have been derived from the receipt mentioning the purchase of a new glove. This glove, however, was meant for the executioner. It's not unlikely for people to have misinterpreted the receipt, or perhaps the artists of the fresco added their own creative details to make it more interesting. Ultimately, the receipt for the execution is the only primary source about this event, and everything past that is merely legend. You won't be surprised to know that medieval Europeans also put actual humans to trial. Whether they were alive or not was a different question. I'd like you to meet Pope Formosus, whose name actually means handsome. This man achieved a number of things and was a rather controversial figure. The story starts in the Carolingian Empire, a small empire in Western Europe which is often considered to be the precursor to the Holy Roman Empire. By the late 9th century, the Carolingian Empire seemed to experience a similar fate to the Western Roman Empire. Vikings raided the empire from the north and Muslims attacked from the south. The Carolingian Empire was often split into several independent kingdoms before a certain man named Charles the Fat centralized the kingdom for a brief period. Unfortunately for him, the Frankish nobility kicked him out and he died a year later. After that, the kingdom became fractured, and there were many people who thought they had the right to unite the Carolingian Empire once again. The Pope was the only person who could legitimately crown an emperor, ever since Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as emperor of their so-called Romans on Christmas Day 800 AD. The Roman part of that title is a little confusing, but broadly speaking it meant Charlemagne was the militant protector of the Catholic Church. You'd expect this ability gave the popes an immense amount of power, which was true, but it also came with a lot of disadvantages. Because the Carolingian Empire had many different kings and warlords who were often equal in power and in influence, most of them pressured the Pope to crown them as emperor. Basically, the Pope's role became much more political than spiritual. Pope Formosus had beef with the King of Italy, who had a surprisingly plebeian name, Guy III of Spoleto. Guy, like most guys, loved power and money, and he had already forced the previous Pope to name him Holy Roman Emperor. Feeling mighty grand, he had the audacity to force Formosus to name his son, Lambert, as co-emperor. But Formosus didn't like being told what to do, and so he decided to make an alliance with Arnulf of Carinthia, the king of East Francia, and supposedly encouraged him to invade Italy so Formosus could free himself of Guy III's papal hostage. This plan actually worked, and Formosus liked Arnulf so much better than Guy, he crowned him as the new Holy Roman Emperor. It looked like Formosus and Arnulf would live happily ever after. Unfortunately, they lived during the early European Middle Ages. Arnulf was struck with paralysis soon after he was crowned emperor, weakening his position in the invasion of Italy, and Formosus mysteriously died a few weeks later. No one knows why or how. His successor, Boniface VI, enjoyed the role of pope for 15 days before he also died. Some say of gout, but who knows. After him came Stephen VI. He luckily didn't immediately die. Guy III also died mysteriously during Arnulf's invasion in Italy because, well, people died all the time back then, and he was replaced by his son Lambert. This is the part when things got a little funky. The popular version of this story is that Lambert forced the recently deceased Formosus to stand trial as a means of revenge. However, more recent analyses of the event argue that Lambert actually may have been displeased with his trial. Stephen VI was originally aligned with Arnulf of Carinthia, but Arnulf's campaign in Italy took a turn for the worse along with his health. As Lambert and the Spoletans returned to Rome, Stephen realized he wasn't on the winning team anymore, and he made a strategic move. He offered his loyalty by denouncing Pope Formosus in the form of a trial. But the trial wasn't just to show Stephen VI's loyalty to Lambert. It was likely Formosus was venerated as a martyr by some citizens. The trial was a way to erase Formosus' sanctity and to prevent the people who revered Formosus from keeping relics of his body to sustain his legacy, thus further establishing the Italians as the only ones who were in control of the papacy. If this was Stephen's plan, it did not pan out well for him. His papacy lasted a little more than a year. The trial was deeply unpopular, and public outcry caused Stephen VI to be deposed, imprisoned, and strangled to death. Stephen's successor, Theodore II, ordered Formosus' body to be rescued from the river in which it was thrown, and the church later re-established Formosus' legacy and he was given a proper burial. Lambert agreed with the re-establishment of Pope Formosus' legacy because Pope Stephen's trial against him ruled that he was never a legitimate pope and that everything Formosus did was annulled, including his coronation of Arnulf. However, Formosus was also forced to crown Lambert as co-emperor, which essentially meant his title of Holy Roman Emperor was now questionable. It isn't entirely clear what came of this issue, but medieval politics were wacky, and the most likely truth is that Stephen VI expected no one would think too hard about the legal implications his little trial caused. He was ultimately wrong because in 898 Lambert and Pope John IX came together and agreed to throw out the rulings of the Cadaver Synod, officially recognizing that Pope Formosus was the rightful pope at the time and thus strengthening Lambert's claim to the throne. However, they still denounced Formosus' coronation of Arnulf of Carinthia, claiming that Arnulf forced Formosus to crown him. That was technically a lie, but it worked, and so neither the Pope nor the King had to question who was who ever again. although they did fight over who could appoint bishops a few centuries later, and there was also the time when the King of France sent his goons to punch the Pope in the face, but that's a story for another time. Whatever pop culture has taught you about the Middle Ages, little of it is likely to give you a complete idea of what that time was really like, because after all, the Middle Ages were 1,000 years in 1,000 different places. Maybe we are all living in the Second Middle Ages and they'd only end in the year 2500. Now, I'm no scientist, but I would say that most of my viewers would be dead by that point.
Time is an illusion invented by the CIA.
No one asked. Don't worry, he's fine. Do you know what will also happen in the year 2500? My next video, so be sure to subscribe to stay alive to see that day. But for now, have a nice day, or evening, or morning, or whatever. Goodbye.